Welcome to the Explainer. Picture the globe back in the late 1960s. We're looking at incredibly rigid, deeply entrenched Cold War lines. It was a massive geopolitical chess match, seemingly frozen in place, with the United States and the Soviet Union locked in an absolute ideological standoff. But what happens when you introduce flexible, modern realities to that rigid board? Well, when the old rules are suddenly thrown out the window, the consequences echo for generations. So, how exactly did ending one Cold War manage to start an entirely new one? It's a pretty profound historical irony, and it's exactly what we're going to explore today. Just picture a comical, giant elbow macaroni shaped like a question mark in your mind's eye for a second, because things are about to get twisty, complex, and deeply interconnected. We are going to explore how a brilliant diplomatic masterstroke to ease tensions in the 20th century actually built the structural foundation for the 21st century's defining superpower rivalry. Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1, the core concept. Moving from rigid ideology to pragmatic flexibility. For decades, Cold War alliances were a lot like stiff, uncooked macaroni. Totally unbending and pretty fragile. But Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, they wanted to completely change the recipe through détente, a deliberate easing of tensions pursued in the late 1960s and 70s. Instead of the rigid, ideological containment of the past, Washington sought balance of power diplomacy. The goal was to wind down the quagmire of the Vietnam War and put the squeeze on Moscow by fundamentally changing the rules of the international game. The philosophy driving this whole shift is called realpolitik. Basically, it's practical, pragmatic diplomacy based on raw power and circumstances, rather than ideological or moral absolutes. Think of it as a complex, tangled noodle mosaic, where practical leverage matters so much more than textbook ideology. The world wasn't just democracy versus communism anymore. It was about who held the tactical leverage, and exactly how that leverage could be weaponized to secure national interests. So how do you actually get that leverage? Well, through triangular diplomacy, specifically by exploiting the Sino-Soviet split. The U.S. realized that China and the Soviet Union, despite both being communist nations, actually had a bitter ideological and territorial rivalry. By opening secret back channels with Chairman Mao Zedong's People's Republic of China, Washington gained massive strategic leverage over the Soviets. And China, they desperately secured a counterweight against the terrifying threat of a Soviet invasion. It was an absolute win-win for two former enemies. Which brings us to Section 2, why enemies needed each other. Let's look at the acute strategic vulnerabilities in 1969. Now, what's really interesting about this dynamic is the sheer mutual desperation that basically forced Washington and Beijing to completely rethink 2 decades of intense hostility. Back in 1969, both sides faced monumental, desperate vulnerabilities. On the American side, you've got the quagmire of Vietnam and a newly nuclear-empowered USSR. Washington desperately needed new diplomatic levers to force Moscow into arms control negotiations. On the Chinese side, a bloody border war with the Soviets along the Ussuri River, bringing them right to the brink of open conflict. Plus, Mao and Premier Zhou Enlai were completely exhausted by the chaos and sheer isolation of the Cultural Revolution. Get this, Moscow had even quietly probed Washington on how the U.S. would react to a preemptive Soviet nuclear strike on Chinese facilities. Literally, neither side could afford the status quo. All right, on to Section 3, ping pong and secret flights. This is the covert path to the Shanghai Communique. Seriously, how do two bitter enemies actually connect when the whole world is watching their every move? Well, Henry Kissinger executed this connection like something straight out of a geopolitical heist movie in July 1971. Step 1, travel publicly to Pakistan. Step 2, fake a sudden stomach illness to completely ditch the international press corps. Step 3, take a highly classified secret flight to Beijing, aptly named Operation Marco Polo, just to arrange a presidential summit. It was a risky, totally audacious, and completely unorthodox solution to a massive diplomatic roadblock. And the speed of this thaw was just staggering. April 1971, you have ping-pong diplomacy breaking the ice when the Chinese table tennis team famously invites the U.S. team to Beijing. Just a few months later, in July 1971, Kissinger takes his covert flight. And by February 1972, Richard Nixon is spending a historic, world-changing week in China. Just walk through that in your mind. From table tennis players exchanging pleasantries to the President of the United States stepping onto Chinese soil and permanently altering the Cold War balance of power, all in less than a single year. The ultimate culmination of that visit was the Shanghai Communique, which is honestly an absolute masterclass in diplomatic ambiguity. Both nations issued this document, and crucially, both agreed to oppose hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region. Make no mistake, this was a direct, highly calculated shot right at the USSR. They were deliberately prioritizing their strategic alignment over any sense of ideological purity. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer genius of that ambiguity. The US simply acknowledged that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China. That framework deftly deferred the extremely thorny Taiwan question. By kicking that can down the road and basically agreeing to disagree without derailing the talks, it allowed actual, functional trade and diplomatic ties to start growing between the two superpowers. Moving on to Section 4, Birth of a Modern Rivalry, the Unintended Historical Hangover. Let's see how this builds across the eras, because while the short-term goals, like pressuring Moscow into the 1972 SALT Treaty and isolating North Vietnam, were massive successes, a completely new chessboard was inadvertently being built. The relationship rapidly evolved through three distinct eras. In the 1970s and 80s, the primary dynamic was an anti-Soviet strategic coalition, heavily driven by U.S. intelligence sharing and formal diplomatic recognition. Then, in the 90s and 2000s, it shifted to economic integration, what some call Chimerica, driven by Deng Xiaoping's market reforms and China's WTO accession. But in the 2010s to the present, it has hardened into a structural superpower rivalry, defined by intense tech and defense competition, as well as strategic decoupling. The dominoes really fell quickly. In 1979, Jimmy Carter established formal diplomatic recognition. Soon after, Deng Xiaoping's market reforms dramatically opened up the Chinese economy to the rest of the world. Fast forward to 2001, and the U.S. actually actively backed China's entry into the World Trade Organization, operating under the widespread belief that economic growth would naturally, eventually foster political liberalization. But instead, China leveraged that incredible global integration to become a massive industrial powerhouse. That deep economic interdependence transformed into today's strategic decoupling, rather than the democratic alignment Washington had hoped for. And that brings us to Section 5, the historical and macro takeaway. The paradox of realpolitik. By ultimately integrating a quarter of the world's population into global trade, the Earth's economic center of gravity fundamentally shifted. Nixon's pivot to China is widely regarded today as one of the most brilliant tactical maneuvers in diplomatic history. It broke the Soviet bloc and effectively won the Cold War game of triangular diplomacy. But, entirely inadvertently, bringing that massive population into the global trading system laid the immense structural foundation for China's meteoric economic rise. The tactical victory of yesterday quite literally built the geopolitical reality of today. So it leaves us with this really provocative question. Does winning a geopolitical game always just start a harder one? Nixon and Kissinger's 1970s masterstroke created a complex, tangled noodle mosaic of global trade and leverage that directly birthed the superpower rivalry we see today. It really makes you wonder what today's diplomatic victories will create tomorrow, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this helps you see the geopolitical board a little more clearly. Keep asking questions and keep learning.